If you ever want to know who truly owns a place, do not watch the person standing behind the microphone. Watch the person everyone else is trying to keep away from the paperwork. By the time Deputy Aaron Caldwell reached the stage, nearly 80 people had gathered inside the great room of Blackwood Ridge Lodge. Fresh coffee filled the air, soft music drifted through hidden speakers, and blue banners stretched across the hand-hewn timber beams announcing Pine Crest Executive Retreat, building our shared future. Guests wearing matching blue name badges laughed with one another as though they had been coming there for years. Caterers moved between tables carrying trays of pastries, while a projector displayed photographs of my lodge during every season. My front porch, my hiking trails, my fireplace. My family's property had somehow become the centerpiece of someone else's success story. Standing beneath the largest banner was Vanessa Whitmore, president of Pinecrest Estates Homeowners Association. Dressed in a crisp white blazer and polished leather boots, she spoke with absolute confidence about leadership, community investment, and shared ownership. Every few sentences, she pointed toward the massive stone fireplace behind her as if it represented everything her association had built together. Every round of applause made her smile a little wider. She looked exactly like someone introducing guests to a place she believed belonged to her. Then the front doors opened. Deputy Aaron Caldwell entered with two deputies walking calmly a few steps behind him. Most guests barely noticed them. Vanessa did. In fact, she smiled the moment she saw Aaron approaching the stage. She actually looked relieved. She believed law enforcement had finally arrived to remove the only person who had spent the day asking questions she could not comfortably answer. Aaron walked past every row of chairs without looking in my direction. He stepped onto the platform, reached toward the sound system, switched off the wireless microphone, and allowed the silence to settle naturally across the room. Even the projector suddenly sounded loud. Nearly 80 people turned toward the stage at exactly the same moment. Volunteers stopped handing out coffee. Caterers paused beside the buffet tables. A young staff member quietly lowered a sign reading members only that had been standing beside the hallway leading to the guest rooms. That small sign caught my attention because it summed up the entire weekend. Someone had convinced dozens of innocent people that they had the authority to decide who belonged on my property. Aaron looked across the audience before speaking. Ladies and gentlemen, this event is being suspended while ownership records are being reviewed. Please leave all association registration materials, payment records, contracts, promotional materials, and event documents where they are until that review is complete. Confused whispers spread immediately. Several guests looked toward Vanessa for reassurance. Others glanced at the banners overhead as though trying to understand what could possibly be wrong. Vanessa recovered almost instantly. Her smile returned before anyone else had the chance to react. "Deputy," she said confidently, "there has been a misunderstanding. Blackwood Ridge Lodge is reserved exclusively for Pine Crest members this weekend under a fully executed property agreement." She lifted a thick leather portfolio from the podium and held it high enough for nearby guests to notice. Several members of the HOA board visibly relaxed. One even folded his arms with a satisfied smile, as though the conversation had already been settled. I remained exactly where I had been standing beside the old stone fireplace my father built nearly 40 years earlier. My hands stayed inside the pockets of my canvas jacket. I did not interrupt Vanessa. I did not correct her. 3 days earlier, I had learned something important about people who rely on false authority. The more certain they become, the more evidence they create. Aaron extended his hand. "May I review the agreement?" Vanessa immediately handed him the portfolio. While Aaron quietly turned one page after another volunteer approached a guest carrying a camera. "Photography during presentations is limited to registered members," she whispered politely. The guest apologized and lowered the camera without asking another question. Another tiny piece of evidence. Even the volunteers believed the association had the authority to control what people could document inside my own lodge. Aaron reached the final page of the agreement and stopped. He studied it carefully without saying a word. Vanessa finally broke the silence. "Everything is there," she said. "The previous owner signed the agreement personally." I spoke for the first time since the deputies entered the room. My voice was calm enough that several guests leaned forward just to hear it. "Deputy," I said, "before you read anything else, would you mind taking a closer look at the signature page?" Aaron lowered his eyes back to the document. Vanessa's smile did not disappear completely, but for less than a second something changed. It was barely noticeable. A tiny hesitation around her eyes. The kind that appears when someone suddenly remembers one detail they hoped nobody else would ever notice. Nobody else in that room recognized it. I did. Because 3 days earlier, that same signature had already told me a story that could not possibly be true. 3 days earlier, Blackwood Ridge Lodge was exactly the way it had always been whenever I returned from town. Quiet. The only sounds were the wind moving through the tall pines and the creek winding below the eastern ridge. I had spent 2 days meeting with my attorney about an unrelated utility easement and expected nothing more exciting than checking the mailbox before making a fresh pot of coffee. I was wrong. The moment I turned onto my private gravel road, everything changed. A line of luxury sport utility vehicles stretched nearly a quarter of a mile along the shoulder. Every parking space near the lodge was already full. A charter bus idled beside my entrance gate, while volunteers unloaded rolling suitcases, presentation displays, catering supplies, floral arrangements, and stacks of branded welcome boxes. Temporary wooden signs had been planted along my private driveway with bright white lettering that read "Welcome Leaders, Registration Ahead, Members Only Beyond This Point, and Private Event." None of those signs had been there. When I left 48 hours earlier, I slowed my truck almost to a stop, wondering whether someone had accidentally entered the wrong property. Then I noticed something impossible to ignore. My entrance gate stood wide open even though I always closed it before leaving town, and someone had attached a large pine crest welcome banner directly to the cedar gateposts my father had built by hand. Whoever organized this event had not simply entered my property. They had redecorated it as though they expected to stay indefinitely. The farther I drove, the stranger everything became. White event tents stood beside the lodge. Folding tables covered with fresh linen filled the lawn beneath the oak trees my father planted after finishing construction in 1987. Caterers carried trays of breakfast pastries through the front doors while another crew unloaded speakers, projection screens, floral arrangements, and expensive lighting equipment. Decorative flags lined the stone walkway leading to the entrance. Nobody looked nervous. Nobody acted like they were trespassing. They moved with the confidence of people who believed every inch of the property had been reserved months in advance. Before I had even closed the truck door, a cheerful young volunteer wearing a blue pine crest badge approached with a clipboard and an enthusiastic smile. "Good morning," she said. "Welcome to the executive retreat. Registration is just inside. If you have not checked in yet, we can print your badge in less than a minute." I thanked her politely. She never asked who I was. She assumed I belonged there because everyone arriving that morning had apparently received the same welcome. As I started walking toward the lodge, another volunteer stepped in front of me with a friendly smile. "Sir, once you check in, please wear your badge where it is visible at all times. The guest rooms, conference areas, and hiking trails are reserved exclusively for registered members." I almost laughed, but instead I simply nodded. I was being politely instructed how to access my own property. That small exchange told me something important. Whoever organized the retreat had convinced every volunteer that the association possessed complete authority over Blackwood Ridge Lodge. As I reached the front porch, another detail immediately caught my attention. A professionally designed display featured framed photographs of my lodge during every season of the year. Spring wildflowers beside the porch, summer sunsets from the overlook, autumn leaves surrounding the fishing pond, snow covering the roof in winter. Every image had been professionally edited to remove anything identifying the Mercer family. Beneath the photographs sat a polished brass plaque reading Pine Crest Leadership Campus, established for our members. It looked less like event advertising and more like a permanent ownership display. Inside, the transformation was even more remarkable. The great room had become a conference center. Rows of rented chairs faced a temporary stage. Large projection screens flanked the stone fireplace my father had spent nearly an entire summer building. Volunteers handed out welcome packets while soft instrumental music drifted through hidden speakers. Guests complimented the scenery, thanked staff members for selecting such an incredible venue, and openly discussed returning next year. Nobody questioned who actually owned the lodge because everything around them suggested the answer had already been settled. Near the registration desk, I quietly picked up one of the glossy welcome folders. Inside, I found a professionally printed schedule listing keynote presentations, networking lunches, guided hikes, executive workshops, and private leadership dinners. Tucked behind the schedule was another brochure advertising 6 additional retreats over the next 12 months. Premium registration packages started at $2,800 per guest, while executive memberships promised priority access to future events held at Blackwood Ridge Lodge. I slowly turned another page and found professionally photographed images of my hiking trails, my fishing pond, my workshop, and even the old overlook where my father drank coffee almost every morning after retirement. That was the moment I stopped wondering whether someone had mistakenly borrowed my property for a weekend. This operation had been planned for months, marketed like a permanent business, and sold to dozens of completely innocent people who genuinely believed they had been invited onto property that belonged to the association. At that point, I still thought the banners were the biggest problem. I had no idea the brochure in my hands was about to become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. I slipped the welcome folder back onto the registration table exactly where I had found it and continued walking through the lodge without attracting attention. The less I said, the more people volunteered. Guests smiled politely as I passed, assuming I was another executive attending the retreat. Near the coffee station, 2 men discussed how fortunate Pine Crest members were to have their own mountain lodge. A woman beside them replied that Vanessa Whitmore had spent nearly a year securing the property because she wanted members to have a permanent place to gather. Nobody questioned the story because nobody had been given a reason to. Confidence has a way of sounding like truth when it is repeated often enough. Then I noticed something else. A volunteer carefully replaced a small framed sign near the entrance after someone accidentally bumped it. The sign read "Private Property of Pine Crest Estates." I stopped for only a second before taking a photograph with my phone. That sign had not appeared in any of the brochures. It had been created specifically for the event. Another piece of evidence. I wandered deeper into the great room where volunteers arranged welcome gifts across a long walnut table my father had built with his own hands nearly 40 years earlier. Someone had covered part of the tabletop with blue runners embroidered with the Pine Crest logo, hiding the small burn mark my father accidentally left there while repairing an old lantern decades ago. I recognized it immediately, even though no one else possibly could. A young volunteer noticed me looking at the table and smiled. "Beautiful craftsmanship, isn't it?" she asked. President Whitmore wanted every detail to make members feel like they finally had a place to call home. Home. Hearing someone use that word while standing inside my family's lodge was strangely unsettling. I smiled politely. She certainly put a lot of work into this. The volunteer nodded proudly. "Months of planning. She says this is only the beginning. We already have leadership weekends scheduled through next fall." Another new piece of information. This was not simply one retreat. Future events had already been sold. I thanked her and continued toward another display near the hallway leading to the guest rooms. A large board advertised executive summit weekends, strategic leadership retreats, women's leadership conferences, and corporate partnership events. Each listing included pricing, available dates, and luxury accommodation packages. Beside the display sat a framed sign with a large QR code inviting guests to reserve next year's retreat immediately. I scanned it with my phone without completing the reservation. The web page opened to an online booking portal featuring photographs of Blackwood Ridge Lodge on nearly every page. A banner across the top proudly described the property as Pine Crest's exclusive mountain leadership campus. I quietly captured screenshots before closing the page. Every click revealed another layer of planning. I thought I had seen everything. I had not. Nearby, several unopened boxes marked retreat store waited beside the registration desk. One volunteer lifted the lid from a carton while stocking a merchandise shelf. Inside were insulated travel mugs, embroidered jackets, leather notebooks, hiking bottles, canvas tote bags, framed prints of the lodge, and polished metal keychains, each displaying an engraved outline of my family's property beneath the words Pine Crest Leadership Center. Someone had turned my home into a commercial brand. I photographed every shelf before moving toward the rear deck overlooking the valley. Guests stood outside taking pictures of the mountains while discussing which workshops they planned to attend. One gentleman asked another whether the association had recently purchased the property. His friend answered with complete confidence, "No. Vanessa secured it years ago. That is why membership dues increased. She said the investment would benefit everyone. I made a mental note of that statement. If members had been told their dues helped acquire the lodge, then the misunderstanding extended far beyond one weekend retreat. As I walked back inside, I noticed the registration laptop sitting unattended while volunteers welcomed another group arriving from the parking lot. Without touching the computer, I could easily see a check-in screen filled with reservation names. Nearly every available room had already been assigned. Another column listed future reservations stretching months ahead. Beside the keyboard sat a printed waiting list for sold-out events. This operation had already grown far beyond a single gathering. Then I spotted one final detail. A payment summary rested partially beneath the keyboard. I could not read every line, but I could clearly see multiple completed transactions worth thousands of dollars each. That single page confirmed what the brochures only suggested. Money had already changed hands. Moments later, applause echoed through the great room. Volunteers encouraged everyone to find their seats while soft music faded from the speakers. I remained near the back where I could watch both the stage and the audience. Vanessa Whitmore stepped confidently onto the platform, adjusted the microphone, and smiled at the crowd. Behind her, a massive screen displayed a sunrise photograph of Blackwood Ridge Lodge with the words "Our Leadership Home." She welcomed everyone to what she proudly called a historic weekend before announcing that the lodge would serve as the permanent home for Pinecrest's executive programs for years to come. The audience responded with enthusiastic applause. Several people even stood. I did not move. Every promise she made, every future retreat she announced, every reference to long-term ownership quietly answered another question I had been asking myself since arriving. I was no longer trying to determine whether Vanessa believed she had authority over my property. I was beginning to wonder how many people she had already convinced to build their future plans around a lodge that had never belonged to her in the first place, and I had a feeling the evidence I had gathered during the past 20 minutes was only the beginning. When the applause finally faded, guests drifted toward the coffee stations while volunteers directed attendees toward the first breakout sessions. Vanessa Whitmore stepped down from the stage, surrounded by board members congratulating her on what they called another successful retreat. That single word immediately caught my attention. Another. Apparently, this was not the first event held on my property. I waited until the crowd around her began to thin before walking over. She noticed me almost immediately and smiled with the polished confidence of someone greeting another satisfied guest. "I hope you are enjoying the weekend," she said. "The lodge usually impresses people the moment they walk through the front door." I returned the smile. "It certainly does. Whoever owns it has taken exceptional care of it." She laughed softly. "That is exactly why we worked so hard to secure it for our members." There was no hesitation in her voice. She did not sound like someone inventing a story. She sounded like someone who had repeated it so many times that she no longer questioned it herself. "During your presentation," I said, "you mentioned this will become Pinecrest's permanent leadership center." "That is correct," she replied proudly. "Our board invested a great deal of time making this possible." Then I noticed something else. A volunteer approached us carrying a clipboard. "President Whitmore," she said, "3 more guests have already upgraded to the executive package for next year's retreat." Vanessa smiled without even looking at the paperwork. "Wonderful. Make sure they receive priority access before the weekend ends." The volunteer thanked her and hurried away. Another promise. Another transaction. Another piece of evidence. As we continued talking, a middle-aged couple carrying cameras started walking toward the rear hallway where the guest rooms were located. Before they reached the hallway, another volunteer stepped in front of them with a friendly smile. "I am sorry," she said politely. "That area is reserved for registered members only. Please, remain inside the approved conference spaces." The couple apologized immediately and turned around without asking another question. Vanessa watched the exchange with obvious satisfaction before looking back at me. "Good organization keeps everything running smoothly," she said. "People appreciate clear boundaries." I almost smiled at the irony. I imagine they do. Then I asked the simplest question I could think of. Out of curiosity, who actually owns Blackwood Ridge Lodge? Her answer came without even a moment of hesitation. The association controls the property through a fully executed agreement with the previous owner. Complete confidence. No uncertainty. No pause. I nodded politely. "Would you mind if I looked at the agreement?" Instead of becoming defensive, she almost seemed pleased that I had asked. Of course, she replied. Transparency is important to us. She opened the familiar leather portfolio she had been carrying throughout the day and carefully removed a neatly organized packet secured with a binder clip. The first page looked exactly like countless property agreements I had reviewed over the years. Legal descriptions, parcel references, formal contract language, notary acknowledgments. At first glance, it appeared completely legitimate. Most people would have stopped reading after seeing the official formatting. I never do. I slowly turned each page while Vanessa stood quietly beside me with folded arms, completely relaxed. She looked less like someone worried about being questioned and more like someone expecting praise for keeping excellent records. Then I reached the final page. My eyes settled on the owner's signature. I read the name once. Then I read the date beneath it. I stopped. Something was wrong. I looked at the page again before saying a single word. Vanessa finally broke the silence. Everything is in order, she said confidently. Thomas Mercer personally approved community access before we expanded our leadership program. She had just answered a question I had never asked. That interested me almost as much as the signature itself. I quietly handed the agreement back to her. Interesting document, I said. She smiled again. I told you there was nothing unusual about it. I slipped my hands into my jacket pockets and looked directly at her. You may want to verify one detail before your afternoon keynote. She tilted her head slightly. What detail? My voice remained calm enough that no one standing nearby paid the slightest attention to our conversation. You should probably check the date Thomas Mercer passed away. For the first time all day, the confidence in her expression shifted. It lasted less than a heartbeat, just enough for her eyes to lose focus before the smile returned. She gave a quiet laugh. I think you have been misinformed. Maybe, I replied. Or maybe someone else has. I thanked her for letting me review the agreement, turned toward the front porch, and walked away without another word. There was no reason to explain what I had noticed. If there was a problem hidden inside those documents, the smartest thing I could do was let everyone continue relying on them. The longer they relied on that agreement, the stronger the documentary trail would become. Once I stepped outside, I pulled my phone from my pocket and called the one person I trusted to appreciate how expensive a single signature could become. Rebecca Sloan answered before the second ring finished. I did not waste time explaining everything. I simply said, Rebecca, I think someone just built an entire business around paperwork signed by a man who had already been gone for 6 years. Rebecca did not interrupt while I explained what I had found. She listened quietly as I described the agreement, the signature, the date beneath it, Vanessa's confidence, and the way everyone around her accepted the document without question. When I finished, she remained silent for several seconds before asking only one thing. Are you absolutely certain you read the date correctly? I looked back through the lodge windows where guests laughed over coffee beneath the timber beams my father had raised nearly 40 years earlier. I read it twice, I answered. The signature belongs to my father, and the agreement says he signed it almost 2 years after his funeral. Rebecca let out a slow breath. Then do not confront anyone. Do not accuse anyone. Let the retreat continue exactly as planned. I am pulling every county record connected to Blackwood Ridge Lodge. That response was exactly why I trusted Rebecca Sloan. She never argued with people before she verified documents. Facts first, everything else later. I ended the call and remained on the porch watching complete strangers enjoy a place that meant something entirely different to me than it ever could to them. Most guests saw a beautiful mountain lodge surrounded by towering pines and breathtaking views. They admired handcrafted beams, polished stonework, and wide windows overlooking the valley. I saw my father's fingerprints everywhere. Every beam inside the great room came from trees harvested legally on our own land. Every stone in the fireplace had been carried by hand from the creek below the ridge. Every porch railing had been measured twice before a single nail was driven. Thomas Mercer believed that if something was worth building, it was worth building well enough to outlive him. Then I remembered something I had not thought about in years. During construction, my father refused to let anyone sign his name on delivery receipts when he was away from the property. Even if it delayed a shipment, he insisted on signing every important document himself. Paper can remember things people forget, he used to tell me. At the time, I thought he was simply being stubborn. Standing there with Vanessa's agreement still fresh in my mind, Those words suddenly meant something very different. Years later, after my wife passed away following a long illness, the lodge became more than family property. It became the only place where silence felt comforting instead of empty. My father and I developed a quiet routine. Every morning, we carried coffee onto the back porch before sunrise and watched the first light slowly reach the valley below. Sometimes we talked about replacing shingles or clearing fallen trees after winter storms. Other mornings we barely spoke at all. The quiet itself became part of the tradition. As his health gradually declined, developers visited more often hoping he might finally sell. Luxury resort companies wanted the location. Investment firms wanted to transform the lodge into a corporate conference center. One representative proudly explained that executives from across the country would gladly spend thousands of dollars for weekends exactly like the one now taking place behind me. My father thanked him politely before giving the same answer he had given every visitor for years. Some places stop being valuable the moment you reduce them to inventory. About 6 months before he passed away, he invited me into the old workshop behind the lodge. Hanging neatly on the walls were decades of carefully organized tools. From a steel filing cabinet, he removed a thick folder containing the deed, certified survey maps, tax records, trust documents, construction permits, and every official record connected to the property since the day he purchased the land. He rested one hand on the folder before looking directly at me. "People think fences protect property," he said. "They do not. Paperwork protects property because paperwork protects the truth." We spent hours reviewing every document together. He explained county parcel numbers, boundary markers, utility easements, access roads, and the Mercer family trust he had created years earlier so ownership would transfer cleanly after he was gone. Before returning the folder to the cabinet, he smiled and added one final lesson. "Never let anyone borrow my signature. A signature proves the person was actually there." At the time I laughed because it sounded like another one of his practical rules. Standing on that porch years later, it no longer sounded simple. After my father passed away, ownership transferred exactly as he intended. Every tax statement arrived correctly. Every county record matched every survey. Nothing had ever been disputed because there had never been anything to dispute. That was exactly why the signature inside Vanessa Whitmore's agreement troubled me so deeply. It did not merely contain my father's name. It asked every person who read it to believe he had personally approved a commercial retreat nearly 2 years after we had gathered inside that very lodge to celebrate his life. As I looked through the windows at guests applauding a future built upon that impossible signature, my phone vibrated. Rebecca had not finished reviewing the records yet. She had sent only one sentence. "Daniel, I think I just found where they copied it from." Rebecca called less than 20 minutes later. I answered before the first ring had fully ended. "You were right," she said without any introduction. "And it is worse than either of us expected." I remained silent. Rebecca had a habit of laying out facts in the order they mattered most. I pulled the certified copy of the original emergency access agreement from the county archive, she continued. "Then I compared it page by page with the document Vanessa showed you." I walked slowly toward the old workshop behind the lodge, away from the conversations drifting across the lawn. "What did you find?" Large portions of the agreement are identical. Entire paragraphs were copied almost word for word. Someone replaced emergency vehicle access with community access, replaced temporary access during declared emergencies with permanent leadership activities, and left most of the legal formatting exactly the same. I stopped beside the workshop door. "And the signature?" There was a brief pause. "Daniel, the signature appears to have been reproduced from the original county document. The placement, spacing, and angle are almost identical. It does not look like someone signed your father's name. It looks like someone copied it." I slowly looked back toward the lodge where guests laughed beneath banners carrying the Pine Crest logo. The entire weekend had been built around paperwork that appeared to begin with a legitimate county record before becoming something completely different. Then Rebecca added something I had not been expecting. "That is not even the biggest problem anymore." "What do you mean?" While comparing the documents, I searched the association's public event listings. I waited. Blackwood Ridge Lodge is being advertised as Pine Crest's permanent leadership campus on multiple promotional pages. 6 additional retreats are already listed as sold out. I closed my eyes for a moment. Sold out? Yes, based on the published Registration prices, advance reservations alone appear to exceed $180,000. For a few seconds I said nothing. I had spent the morning thinking this was about one unauthorized weekend. Rebecca had just shown me it was an ongoing commercial operation. Before I could respond, another call came through. It was the security company that monitored the lodge whenever I traveled. I answered immediately. "Mr. Mercer," the manager said, "I wanted to confirm whether you recently reactivated an old contractor access code." "No," I answered. "Which code?" "Mark Ellison's." I remembered Mark immediately. He had handled seasonal maintenance years earlier before retiring. His access credentials should have been removed long ago. "Can you send me the complete gate history?" I asked. "Already doing it." Less than a minute later, the report appeared in my email. I opened it while standing outside the workshop. The entries stretched back almost 3 months. Landscaping trucks, catering companies, furniture rentals, audio suppliers, portable restroom deliveries, printing services. Every visit had been logged using the same inactive contractor code. The retreat had not appeared over a single weekend. It had been assembled piece by piece for months. I immediately forwarded the report to Rebecca. She called again before I even reached the porch. "These logs are exactly what we needed," she said. "Now we can establish a preparation timeline that begins long before the first guest arrived." Every delivery supports the same conclusion. I looked toward the registration area where another volunteer was encouraging guests to scan a QR code before leaving. "There is one more thing," I said. "They are still accepting reservations." "Good," Rebecca replied. "Let them continue." I laughed quietly. "Most lawyers would tell me to stop this immediately." "Most lawyers would," she answered. "But right now, every brochure they distribute, every reservation they accept, every payment they process, and every statement Vanessa makes creates another piece of documentary evidence. They believe they are building a successful business. In reality, they are building a timeline." I watched a couple smiling as they completed a reservation for next year's retreat before placing their confirmation inside a welcome folder. They had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. They were trusting what every sign, brochure, banner, and presentation told them. That realization bothered me far more than the banners themselves. The guests were not taking advantage of my property. They were being misled along with everyone else. "What do you want me to do now?" I finally asked. Rebecca answered without hesitation. "Go back inside. Listen more than you speak. Ask only the questions you already know the answers to. If Vanessa believes everything is legitimate, she will gladly confirm it herself. And when the time comes, her own words will connect every document we already have. Sometimes the strongest evidence is not found in a courthouse. Sometimes it walks onto a stage, picks up a microphone, and volunteers everything you needed to prove." Rebecca called one final time just before the afternoon keynote began. "Everything we need is finally in place," she said. "But there is still one piece of evidence no county record can ever provide." I already knew what she meant. Her own words. "Exactly," Rebecca replied. "Right now we have the certified deed, the trust records, the original emergency access agreement, the copied legal language, the gate access logs, the booking website, the reservation estimates, and the preparation timeline. What we do not have is Vanessa personally connecting herself to every decision. Do not accuse her. Do not challenge her. Ask simple questions and let her answer them. The less you say, the more she will volunteer. My father used to tell me that people become careful when they think someone is trying to expose them, but they become careless when they believe someone is admiring their success." Vanessa had spent the entire day surrounded by applause. She had no reason to expect one more conversation would be any different. I slipped my phone back into my jacket pocket and walked toward the lodge. The afternoon crowd had grown even larger. More guests had arrived from nearby hotels. Volunteers were welcoming late registrations. And another stack of blue name badges sat neatly beside the registration desk. A large display near the entrance now read only a few spaces remain for next year's leadership retreats. Another volunteer encouraged guests to reserve their place before leaving the property. Every few minutes, the registration laptop chimed with another completed reservation. Every confirmation represented another promise built upon property the association did not own. Inside the great room, a professionally produced video played across the projection screen. Executives hiked my trails, shared meals beside my fireplace, stood on the overlook where my father used to drink coffee every morning, and gathered beneath the timber beams he had raised with his own hands. The final image appeared in bold letters across the screen. Your leadership home for years to come. The audience applauded enthusiastically as Vanessa Whitmore stepped back onto the stage. She thanked everyone for believing in Pinecrest's long-term vision before smiling confidently at the crowd. This weekend is only the beginning, she announced. Our board has spent years creating a permanent destination where future leaders can gather, grow, and build lasting relationships. More applause followed. She continued without hesitation. Because of your incredible support, we have expanded next year's retreat calendar, increased executive membership opportunities, and secured this location for the foreseeable future. Several guests immediately scanned the reservation QR code projected behind her. Others opened the booking page on their phones. Another volunteer quietly celebrated yet another completed reservation. Every promise Vanessa made became another piece of evidence. Every reservation reinforced another claim of authority. When the presentation ended, attendees formed a line to thank her personally. Some wanted photographs. Others wanted information about future retreats. I quietly joined the end of the line and waited. By the time I reached the front, only a handful of board members remained nearby. Vanessa recognized me immediately and smiled with exactly the same confidence she had shown throughout the day. I am glad you decided to stay, she said. Most people realize pretty quickly that this place speaks for itself. It certainly does, I replied. Actually, there is one final detail I wanted to understand. Of course, she answered. Earlier today you mentioned that Thomas Mercer personally approved the association's use of Blackwood Ridge Lodge. She nodded immediately. That is correct. Just so I understand completely, I continued. Are you personally confirming that he authorized Pinecrest Estates to conduct leadership retreats, advertise this property, sell future reservations, and operate these programs here? Absolutely, she replied without the slightest hesitation. Everything was negotiated properly before we expanded the program. None of these events would exist without his approval. One board member standing beside her smiled proudly and nodded in agreement. Another added, President Whitmore handled the entire process herself. I had not expected that answer, but Rebecca certainly would appreciate it. A guest waiting behind me quietly lowered the brochure he had been reading. Another attendee, hoping to record a short greeting for coworkers back home, unknowingly captured our entire conversation on video. Vanessa never noticed. She believed she had answered another routine question from another interested guest. Instead, she had personally confirmed the agreement, accepted responsibility for the claimed authorization, connected herself to the future reservations, reinforced the association's ownership claims, and publicly repeated that my late father had approved everything. No document could have tied the evidence together more effectively than those few confident answers. I thanked her for her time and stepped away without another word. Before I reached the back of the room, my phone vibrated. Rebecca had sent a single message containing 6 words. Perfect. The deputies just arrived outside. The afternoon keynote had barely resumed when the front doors opened once again. Deputy Aaron Caldwell entered with 2 deputies walking calmly a few steps behind him. Their pace was steady, professional, and completely unhurried. Most guests assumed they were responding to an ordinary request. Vanessa certainly did. She smiled the moment she saw Aaron approaching the stage, clearly expecting him to remove the only man who had spent the day asking inconvenient questions. Aaron walked past every row of chairs without looking in my direction. He stepped onto the platform, reached toward the sound system, and quietly switched off the microphone. The room fell silent almost immediately. Even the projector suddenly sounded loud. Nearly 80 guests turned toward the stage. Volunteers stopped handing out refreshments. Caterers paused beside the buffet tables. The volunteer standing at the reservation table slowly lowered another stack of next year's booking packets. Aaron looked across the audience before speaking in the same calm voice I had heard him use during every property dispute he had ever handled. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to pause today's event while ownership records are reviewed. Please leave all association registration materials, payment records, promotional materials, contracts, reservation documents, and electronic registration devices where they are until that review is complete. Confused whispers spread throughout the lodge. Several guests immediately looked toward Vanessa, expecting another confident explanation. She recovered almost instantly. "There is no reason for concern," she announced with a reassuring smile. "Everything has already been documented. Our association has a fully executed agreement authorizing our use of this property." She lifted the familiar leather portfolio from the podium and confidently handed it to Aaron. Several members of the HOA board visibly relaxed. One even smiled toward the audience as though the interruption would soon confirm everything Vanessa had been saying all weekend. Aaron accepted the portfolio without comment and slowly reviewed each page. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody needed to. A few moments later, the front doors opened again. Rebecca Sloan entered carrying a thick accordion file filled with certified county records. She joined Aaron at the podium and quietly placed the documents beside Vanessa's agreement. First came the certified deed, identifying the Mercer Family Trust as the recorded owner of Blackwood Ridge Lodge. Then came the official parcel map confirming the property boundaries. Next came the original emergency access agreement from the county archive. Finally, she placed Thomas Mercer's death certificate beside the remaining documents. The room became completely silent. Guests who had expected another leadership presentation now found themselves watching official property records being compared one page at a time. Aaron reached the signature page of Vanessa's agreement before opening the original emergency access agreement to the corresponding page. Rebecca placed the certified comparison beside both documents. "The county has confirmed these records," she explained calmly. "Mr. Mercer passed away 6 years ago. The agreement presented by the association is dated almost 2 years after his death. The only authentic recorded agreement involving this property authorized temporary emergency vehicle access across the lower service road during declared wildfire emergencies. It did not authorize overnight lodging, commercial events, public retreats, promotional use, future reservations, merchandise sales, or association control of Blackwood Ridge Lodge. That agreement also expired 3 years ago." Aaron nodded before turning toward Vanessa. His expression never changed. "Ma'am, these documents raise significant questions regarding the agreement your organization relied upon. Until those questions are resolved, this event cannot continue." Vanessa stared at the paperwork as though she had never seen it before. "There has to be some mistake," she said quietly. "We were told everything had already been handled." Rebecca calmly opened another section of the accordion file. One by one, she placed additional documents across the podium. Gate access logs showing months of repeated entries using an inactive contractor code. Screenshots of the online reservation portal advertising 6 sold-out future retreats. Printed reservation summaries reflecting substantial advance payments. Photographs of merchandise displaying Blackwood Ridge Lodge as Pinecrest's Leadership Center. Promotional brochures describing the property as the association's permanent campus. Copies of the welcome materials distributed throughout the weekend. Finally, she placed several photographs I had taken that morning, including the private property of Pinecrest Estate sign displayed near my own front entrance. Each document connected perfectly with the next, forming a timeline that stretched back months before the first guest had arrived. Aaron reviewed the evidence without rushing before looking toward the audience once more. At this time, he said calmly, "The ownership representations made during this event do not match the official county records. We are asking everyone to conclude today's program in an orderly manner while these matters are reviewed." Nobody argued. There was nothing left to defend. One guest quietly folded the reservation form he had been completing for next year's retreat. Another removed the blue Pinecrest badge from around his neck and placed it on the registration table. A volunteer slowly lowered the framed sign inviting guests to reserve next year's event. Another reached above the fireplace and carefully removed the large banner reading Pinecrest Leadership Center. For the first time all weekend, the hand-hewn cedar beam my father built nearly 40 years earlier was visible again. The applause had disappeared. The confidence had disappeared. Even the board members who had stood proudly beside Vanessa began stepping quietly away from the stage. Nobody raised a voice. Nobody needed to. The documents had already answered every important question long before anyone realized they should have been asking them. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Guests looked from the certified county records spread across the podium to the glossy retreat brochures still resting in their hands. then back to Vanessa Whitmore, waiting for an explanation that never seemed to arrive. The confidence she had carried throughout the entire weekend slowly faded into visible uncertainty. She opened the leather portfolio once more, turning page after page as though another document might suddenly appear and change what everyone had just witnessed. Nothing did. Rebecca Sloan quietly gathered the certified records into a neat stack before addressing the room in the same calm tone she had maintained all afternoon. The ownership of Blackwood Ridge Lodge has never changed. The Mercer Family Trust remains the only recorded owner, and there is no valid recorded agreement authorizing Pinecrest Estates to advertise, reserve, manage, or operate commercial events on this property. Deputy Aaron Caldwell nodded before addressing the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, today's event has concluded. Please collect your personal belongings in an orderly manner. If you have questions regarding registration fees, future reservations, promotional materials, or payments already made, those questions should be directed to the organization that accepted them. Nobody argued. There was nothing left to debate. A gentleman standing near the front slowly lifted one of the glossy brochures and quietly read the headline aloud. Pinecrest proudly owns and operates Blackwood Ridge Lodge as its permanent leadership campus. He lowered the brochure and looked directly at Vanessa. Is any of this actually true? She opened her mouth to answer, but no words came. Before she could recover, another guest raised the reservation confirmation displayed on his phone. My company approved almost $5,000 for next year's retreat because we believed your association owned this property. A woman standing beside him added softly, my husband and I renewed our membership because this lodge was the reason we stayed. Around the room, people stopped looking toward the stage and started looking at one another. One guest unclipped the blue Pinecrest badge from around his neck and placed it gently on the registration table. Another followed, then another. Within moments, a growing stack of abandoned badges rested beside the untouched welcome folders. One HOA board member quietly removed his identification pin and slipped it into his jacket pocket before walking toward the exit without saying a word. Another folded the display advertising next year's executive retreats and carried it away in silence. Nobody defended the brochures anymore. Nobody repeated the ownership claims. The story that had filled the room all weekend had quietly come apart under the weight of the records lying on the podium. The volunteers who had welcomed everyone that morning began removing banners from the timber beams. One young volunteer paused beside me while carefully folding the large banner that had covered my father's cedar beam all weekend. I am so sorry, she said quietly. We honestly believed everything we were told. I smiled gently. I know you did. None of this was your promise to keep. She nodded, thanked me, and carried the folded banner outside. That conversation meant more to me than any dramatic apology ever could have. The volunteers had never been my opponents. Neither had the guests. They had trusted what looked official, sounded convincing, and appeared to be supported by paperwork. As people slowly gathered their luggage, several stopped to shake my hand before leaving. One elderly gentleman looked around the great room and smiled. You never raised your voice once. I smiled back. I did not need to. The records had been speaking all along. Someone finally decided to read them. He laughed softly before wishing me well and walking toward the parking area. By late afternoon, Blackwood Ridge Lodge was quietly becoming itself again. Audio technicians disconnected speakers. Caterers packed away untouched desserts. Registration tables disappeared. Decorative flags came down. Volunteers removed every Pinecrest sign from the property. Through the front windows, I watched the temporary welcome displays being loaded into trailers one after another until the entrance road looked exactly the way my father had left it years earlier. During the following weeks, every advertisement featuring Blackwood Ridge Lodge disappeared from the association's promotional materials. The online reservation portal was taken offline. Future retreats scheduled at the lodge were canceled. Guests received instructions regarding refunds from the organization, and every photograph of my property quietly vanished from the promotional pages I had documented that weekend. I replaced every gate access code, upgraded the security system, and installed a simple cedar sign beside the entrance road that read private property. Authorized access only. It was not meant to challenge anyone. It simply reflected the truth. A few mornings later, I carried a cup of coffee onto the back porch just before sunrise. The valley below was quiet again. Wind moved gently through the pine trees, and the first light slowly reached the overlook where my father and I had spent so many peaceful mornings together. I thought about the afternoon he placed that thick folder of deeds, surveys, and county records into my hands inside the workshop. At the time, I believed he was teaching me how to protect a piece of land. Standing there after everything that had happened, I finally understood what he had really been protecting. It was never just the lodge. It was the truth attached to it. Buildings can be decorated. Signs can be replaced. Banners can be hung. Stories can be rehearsed. But a properly recorded deed has something none of those things will ever possess. It does not need applause. It does not need a stage. It simply waits with quiet patience until the day someone decides to compare the story being told with the truth that was recorded all along.